Hi, welcome back to See God. This is Michael, and today we are talking about failure. Not failing in life, but failing in the gym or in your workout, wherever it may be. Before we get into defining failure, I think it is important that we understand why does it matter. Well, it matters because you want to train with intensity, right? You want to make sure that you are training enough. Well, what better way to tell that you have completely exhausted your resources than reaching failure, than ensuring that you cannot do another repetition? So then, Michael, what is failure? Well, I kind of have it broken down into three main categories. Let's start with failure and what it actually should be, in my opinion. That can be referred to as muscular failure, the true, the one, the only failure, right? What does muscular failure mean? Muscular failure is when you cannot perform the exercise with proper technique and full range of motion anymore. So you may be able to perform some partial reps, but you cannot perform the full range of motion, fully strict technique anymore. Any additional repetitions would either not be completed or give up some sort of technique. This is the failure you should keep in mind when you are training, because it is the failure that is most reliable, most consistent, and if you stay beneath or at, you reduce your chance for injury, and you are also making sure you are exhausting the muscle you actually want to exhaust. And we'll go over that in a bit because technique is extremely important, and I haven't talked about it a lot yet. But this is where absolute failure comes in. So a lot of people are like, all right, I'm crazy. I just want to go till my muscle can't move anymore, right? And so they do all sorts of contortions and everything. And you know what? Yes, the muscle may actually work a bit harder, or they may use a bit of power to get them through. I don't know why I'm doing an overhead tricep extension, but they may use a bit of power to get them to the top, and then they let themselves down slowly. And yes, that can eke out a bit more gains. However, in my opinion, it is generally better to make sure that if you do some sort of eccentric overload, you do it in a structured, regimented manner that you can then repeat next time, right? So this is absolute failure. It's when you physically cannot move anymore, even if with all the cheating in the world, right? Then there is one more type of failure which I want to explore. That is psychological failure. So while there are the people who can destroy themselves, don't even need to have good technique, and they just keep going until the muscle doesn't move anymore, there are some people that reach psychological failure before any of these other kinds of failures. That means that either the reps are too intense. So for example, for myself in incline curls, once I get past a certain point, it just starts to really burn. And some people think even that that means they've reached failure. And no is the answer. You have reached failure or muscular failure when you physically, your muscle cannot contract anymore, when you physically cannot complete the repetition anymore. So you want to learn how to push psychological failure to muscular failure and beyond, because then you can get truly the best out of your muscle, because all the muscle cares about is how much tension is being generated through it, right? So if you are using absolute failure as a metric when you complete, proper technique repetitions, and then you go back and you complete some poor technique repetitions, you're doing yourself a disservice, because you may not you're not generating as much tension through it, right? And I'll increase your chances for injury, and it's not repeatable. It's like, well, how much pressure did I use? How much extra momentum did I use, right? And then psychological failure, well, your body doesn't care about what your mind thinks of how hard it is. It only cares, did I actually get to the point where the muscle physically couldn't contract anymore? And if the answer is no, then you have not reached failure, no matter how much your brain tells you you are in pain. And this is okay. This is one that can be worked on and pushed. Meanwhile, absolute failure is one that generally you should get your ego in check, and you should learn better methods for pushing past failure, because it is not necessarily a bad thing to push past failure. It just shouldn't be done with this absolute failure mindset. There are other methods such as drop sets, and eccentric sets, but we can get over that. We'll go over that in the future. Next, there are another three ways of defining failure. One of them is the one which we will refer to almost always. However, depending on the exercise you are doing, the other two may be useful. So the first one is concentric failure. What does that mean? That means that if I do a pull-up, I can't physically pull myself up anymore. So I go to the bottom and then I go up and then I physically can't do another pull-up anymore, right? I can't pull myself up. However, there is isometric failure. What does that mean? That means that I might be able to, aid myself to the top. And by aid myself, I mean step up, do it in a way that is consistent. And we can go over some methods in the future, but aid myself to the top. And then I may get stuck, but I can hold, for example, a middle position, right? And when I can't hold that middle position anymore, and I start to go down slowly, then I have reached isometric failure because I can't pull myself up. So I've reached concentric failure. I am letting myself down, but I can't even stop. That means that I have reached isometric failure. And the final one, and I'm sure you can guess it, is eccentric failure. And eccentric failure is when, let's say I aid myself to the top, then I just drop because the muscles can't even let myself down slowly, right? Basically, because in short, there's three things you can do when performing a movement. You can contract, you can stay still at some point, and then you can let go. And in that order, they are hardest to easiest. So it's much harder to contract. It is a bit easier to hold it isometrically, and it's way easier to let yourself down. And so those are the kind of levels of failure. Important, concentric failure is the only one we will ever really look at. Unless we are doing static holds, for example, such as a front lever or something like that, then obviously isometric failure is very important. And sometimes eccentric failure is important when you are learning an exercise potentially through eccentrics. Okay, next question. When do I do it though? When do I go to failure? Well, we'll get to how close to failure you should get in a little while, but I want to look at, the different systems I'm trying to work. When do I actually want to reach failure to promote growth in that system? Well, famously, hypertrophy, right? There is the reps in reserve system. You generally want to work in the 0 to 5 reps in reserve, which means you have 0 to 5 reps in the tank. And 0 means you have no reps in the tank, which means it is muscular failure. 5 means you have 5 reps in the tank, which means you have 5 reps till you reach muscular failure, right? So hypertrophy, pretty easy. Strength. This is one that is a little more interesting because sometimes, we can, in a sense, see strength as technique because there are a lot of neurological adaptations you do. Therefore, when you are training for strength, you may even cycle lighter and heavier days. You use something called an RPE system, right? Rate of perceived exertion. And basically, the higher you are, so it's a scale from 1 to 10, the higher you are, the closer you are to failure, to not being able to do that repetition even once. We'll go over the system by itself in its entirety. However, within strength context, approaching failure is very useful as when you are trying to maximally exert yourself, that is 1 rep to failure because you wouldn't be able to repeat it again. However, you can do it once, right? Then we have a few other systems within our body. We have a power, speed, endurance system. For power, in short, failure is different. It's not when you can't perform the repetition again. It's when you can't perform it where the concentric is at a high enough speed. Because power is about moving the weight quickly, heavy weights quickly, then it matters how fast you move it. An example, you're training maybe 0.4 to 0.6 seconds. What that means is once you're over the 0.6 second threshold, you have reached power failure. You cannot contract that quickly anymore, and that is failure, right? For speed, it is instead when you are performing a quick action and there just isn't that bounce anymore, right? So for example, you might be doing band assisted jumps and you have a ground contact time of 0.2 seconds, right? Really fast. Then all of a sudden you have a ground contact time of zero point 0.3 seconds and 0.4 seconds. Well, at that point, depending on the range you've chosen for yourself, you have reached speed failure because you can't move that fast. And because these are skills, you actually want to make sure that you stay within that range, right? And then endurance. Well, for endurance, generally when training it, there is no point in reaching failure as this can actually just fatigue you way more than it'll ever help. Sometimes when we are testing our limits, we may do, for example, 50, 60, 70 push-ups as an example, or we may do some ultra marathons or something. However, the body starts to break down at that point, and doing this on a regular basis for training is just not useful. So you actually don't want to train to failure when you are training for endurance. Okay, I wanted to have a quick look at two other little things. So one is, where do I do it? So when I am training, let's say for hypertrophy and strength, because they're the ones where I use it the most, when should I use it? Well, in general, for compounds, when you are training within a hypertrophy and a strength context, because in the other context, we've defined failure in such a way where it's fine, it's safe to reach failure. You actually generally can go to failure in both compound movements and isolation movements. However, compound movements can be a bit more dangerous. So actually staying in the 2 to 5 reps in reserve or in a slightly lower RPE in general can be good for making sure that your joints and everything stay intact. While when you do more isolation type movements, so for example, a bicep curl or something like that, then go for it. Go to failure, it's fine. So single joint movements, because those are what isolation movements are, it's fine to go to failure. Meanwhile, compound, when you start including multiple joints, because you have multiple points of failure, you may be a little unbalanced. There's a lot more load on your body. It can be a little more dangerous. So, in fact, the recommendation is actually learn how to go to failure in both of them. However, it's okay to stick to the higher ranges of the reps in reserve or the lower ranges of RPE when training for strength. When doing compounds, meanwhile in isolations, feel free to destroy yourself and go to failure. Not necessarily every day, but honestly, if you're working some very small muscles like the shoulders, it's not really an issue to go to failure all that much because it's such a small muscle, you recover quickly. In fact, I did want to quickly mention when you're training bigger muscle groups, you can go to failure less. And the reason is simply because failure is exhausting. Failure is very tiring. And you can go to failure as much when you're training bigger muscle groups. However, it may tire you out and it may not allow you to have the frequency and intensity as consistently as you would like. And that's it. So let's recap. Why does it matter? Want to make sure you have that intensity. What is it? Well, the real failure is muscular failure. When your muscle cannot physically perform the exercise with proper technique and full range of motion anymore. The muscle cannot physically contract to do it anymore. You can have it in a concentric, an isometric, and an eccentric form. However, in general, we focus on the concentric. In hypertrophy, it is essential to understand failure. In strength, we can learn how to be a bit further away. However, when we are really trying to push it, getting closer with the RPE system can be very useful. For power speed, it is about what your velocity is with lifting the certain amount of weight or moving yourself at a certain speed. And then for endurance, in general, failure is something actually to be avoided. Compounds versus isolation. So in general, the more of your body used, the better it is to kind of err on the side of not failure or further away from failure. And the reason is simply injury risk and intensity also tires you out a lot more, while in isolations, they are so safe that it is perfectly fine to go for it. That's it. Subscribe to become the most performant you, and I'll see you next time.